We've been working really hard to create a concept of what is a truly transformative decision versus what is an innovation that just promotes the status quo. How do we get out of the realm of what we know, and how do we create the infrastructure to support that kind of visionary thinking? It's not just money, it's infrastructure, it's policy, it's consumer demand, it's industry support, and it's support for these innovators. I have to tell you, the longest journey is the journey between 50 grams of material developed in a lab and a minimum viable prototype that you can present to one of the major brands and say, there, use this. You can make millions of it at the same price performance characteristics that you need. So how do we create this infrastructure? We're working on this. We've invited several people with amazing background in innovation, social entrepreneurship, and a very small consumer brand you've never heard of, who are going to join us right now. Michael, will you please join me?
Thank you.
Michael Goltzman. Michael Goltzman is Vice President Global Public Policy for the environmental sustainability and social impact at the Coca Cola Company. And Michael will talk a lot about their vision for a world free of plastic pollution, what they're doing to create this, and where the innovation opportunities are. Next, I'd like for Saskia Bruysten to join me. Saskia and her 2-month-old baby.
Thank you.
Saskia and her 2-month-old baby made the journey to join us and talk to us about social entrepreneurs. The company Saskia heads up, the Yunus Social Fund, works with social entrepreneurs around the world. They know about the innovation. They know about the innovation on every level. And while their goal is to lift people out of poverty, the reality is that the jobs that they help create are rooted in some of the very problems our entrepreneurs and innovators are looking to solve: waste, plastic pollution, and others. So Saskia will talk to us about how they identify innovation worth looking at and funding, and how they support, what is the infrastructure needed to support that kind of innovation. Next, I would like to ask Joe Lubin to join me. And Joe is the host here. Oh, sorry. Joe is the host, so thank you for, yes, please. You can take the pillow
My cape
off.
was taking up too much
You
space.
don't need the pillow, I guess. Joe needs no introduction, I'm sure, to most of you who are here, but he's a true Renaissance man. So in addition to being an innovator and entrepreneur and the leader of the blockchain revolution, he's also a musician. So in the Q&A session, you can ask him about this. It says so here. Your people said that.
Not correct.
So what we want of Joe is to talk to us about the innovation infrastructure that enables the type of revolution that he has started and leads, and what it constitutes infrastructure for success. How do we get there? How did he get there? What do we need to build? In addition to this, we're expecting also Satya Tripathi, who is the Assistant Secretary General, United Nations. And when he comes in, I will not introduce him, so I'm telling you who he is now. Satya was just appointed in October as the Assistant General of the UN. As you know, that is an organization dedicated to building consumer demand and behavior change, very essential to dealing with this problem that we're talking about. And they also rely on innovation to transform the problem and building consumer demand for that innovation. And last but not least, stuck on the plane, hopefully who will come, is our representative from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And if he does not come, Martin, you are it. I will put you on the spot to talk about the circular economy. But the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has launched a big effort 2 years ago right here about the new plastics economy, which is basically a circular economy for plastics. And their vision of the world is one where there is no waste. And they have a very important contribution to the conversation of how innovation helps us get there from where we are today. So let's jump into the conversation. This is not a panel on plastic pollution, so don't ask technical questions. We're not going to play with technical details about PET bottles and type of waste and things like this. What we want to do is explore the big ideas. How do we create a transformative innovation? What is the infrastructure that is needed for that to happen? I come from the world of Internet 1.0 and 2.0. I was there when IoT was nothing but an idea and just an investment in infrastructure. And what we always think about, my team and I, well, we all have Silicon Valley DNA, is for the Internet of Things to happen, for us to all have Internet-enabled devices today, it took about 20 years of unstoppable innovation. It took a foundation of innovation and investment in software and in hardware, long before anybody knew that there would be a thing called Internet and there would be things called browsers. So that sounds a little like dinosaur speak, but in reality, this was investment of about $2 trillion that allowed ultimately to develop the technologies we use today. And when venture capital got excited about it in the mid-90s, in the early 90s, the infrastructure was already there. The development was there. The software and the technology innovation, for the most part, has been laid out. So we saw an explosion of technology and innovation and a lot of money that flowed in it and transformed everything, all the innovations into an ecosystem that was strong, independent companies competing with each other, rising and falling. And in that competition, what we saw is the world we live in today. So the question is, how do we create these conditions for the innovations around plastics? And what are these innovations that we really need? So my first question would be to Michael Goltzman. And the Coca Cola company is very committed to innovation. They're very committed to a world free of plastic pollution. They do not want beaches littered with Coca Cola cups and bottles. It's recognizable, it's not good for them. And Michael is very passionate about this. So Michael, will you get us started by talking to us a little bit about what is the future you're looking to create?
So a year ago, our CEO, James Quincy, launched our new initiative called A World Without Waste. We're partners with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We're founding members of the New Plastics Economy. One of the key sort of elements of that world without waste is a design element. It means that all the plastic out there today needs to be 100% recyclable, and we are committed to that, getting there by 2025. Today we're at 87% of our portfolio is 100% recyclable. The second element, the second element is really around collection. We know that in order to create a circular economy and use the material more than once, you need to bring it back. And so there's really a need for huge investment in infrastructure. And we have been doing that, but clearly there's a huge opportunity to do more. There are a lot of people who will say, and I tend to agree with them, that we're not going to just recycle our way out of this problem, but that doesn't mean recycling is irrelevant. Because if you're just going to use the material one time, then whether or not you're still wasting the resource. There was still energy and material that went into creating that package. So we want that circular economy, and recycling infrastructure is key to that. And then third is really around partnerships. And so Ellen MacArthur has brought a huge number of companies together to align around some key goals. Circulate Capital is here in the room that's brought some of our competitors together to really invest in what can be some solutions in addressing the ocean plastics issue in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And we realize that we're not going to do this alone, that we really need a full society approach from government, private sector, and civil society to be able to address it. And finally, we need some new business models. So we are looking at, for example, we're launching in Brazil something called a universal bottle. So everyone remembers the refillable glass bottles from your youth, but actually refillable PET has a much lower carbon footprint than even refillable glass. So we're launching and looking to move our portfolio in Brazil to 50% refillables with a ref PET bottle by 2030. We're already increasing massively our refillables in other Latin American countries and looking at opportunities for refillables. The other example maybe I would give you is our our new freestyle technology that many of you may have seen in different restaurants, we've launched now on university campuses. So as you enter university as a freshman, you get your tumbler cup. It's RFID chipped. And so basically you can use that via a beverage subscription at any cafeteria on campus. So you don't actually need a package. It's a packageless delivery of the beverage. And we're increasingly, it's now on cruise lines, and we're rolling that out. And this is not a sort of mini pilot. There are 50,000 plus machines in the market today and expanding internationally into other markets. So those are some of the key, whether it's design, collection, partnership, and new business models. I think those are really the key elements that we see are necessary to have a world without waste.
So, Michael, you participate in the New Plastics Economy initiative. Can you talk a little bit about what your goals are with regards to this initiative and how you move towards a circular model of use of your products or the packaging that goes along with your product?
So the design elements are all, I think Ellen MacArthur Foundation's really done a great service because they've set some sort of common goals and metrics across the broader FMCG industry. And so we are internalizing absolutely those metrics. We're also looking to increasingly use more recycled content. So we've put a goal out there to use 50% recycled content in all of our packages by 2030. We're obviously different markets are at different places, but we did launch over the past year 100% recycled content bottles in Mexico, in South Africa, in Australia, and coming soon in Hong Kong. So we know it can be done, but to do that, of course, you need the empty bottles to provide the feedstock. So that collection element is really critical.
And so when you work towards innovation like the one you described, the RFID embedded chips in vessels on campuses, how do you identify innovation? What is your path to finding innovation that could fit within your production cycles, with your needs? How do you do this? What is your path?
Look, we have a huge R&D team, and they are very focused on really scouting and scoping the world and interacting with huge numbers of entrepreneurs. And in fact, over the past year, we launched 4 new sort of packaging design innovations, whether it's our work with Demeto in Europe, or our investment in Ionica, or our new framework agreement with Loop. So there are lots of those people out there. And as you said, getting from what works at the bench in the lab to actually being commercially viable, there is a gap there, but that's where I think companies can come in. And if there's an opportunity, then you can actually scale that pilot in a contained area and hopefully be able to prove that it works.
Yep. So that touches upon my the whole question I wanted to ask of Joe. So here is one industry, Joe, that needs a certain space for experimentation and prototyping. It needs equipment. It needs, the environment that helps them create MVP. It needs industry guidance and feedback. What parallels do you find with the innovation in your space? And what was the foundation for the innovation explosion in your space? Where did you start? How did you get there?
Sure. So from my perspective, it's all about mechanism design. It's all about mechanism design is essentially defining the goals that you want to achieve and building machinery, building incentivization so that if people are following their own selfish best interest, the whole system works and the whole system achieves the goals that were set out. Ethereum took a page out of the Bitcoin book and wanted to build a decentralized application platform that was founded on some of the same principles as Bitcoin, but instead of being a narrow cryptocurrency, it was supposed to be something that was a trustful infrastructure that you could run any sort of application on. And that had to be decentralized. It had to be radically decentralized. If you have a compute infrastructure that's centralized, there are many different attack vectors that would once there's a lot of value on the system, cause different adversaries to try to capture that system, essentially as we've seen in the internet and the Web 2.0 world. It started out as a decentralized platform, the internet, and because of necessary technical efficiencies that we needed, and because there were just tremendous prizes to capture, it ended up being a siloed walled garden system. And so to create a decentralized compute platform, a world computer, you need, currently there's over 10,000 different nodes that are running the system. You need to incentivize those people to bring their resources to the system, compute, bandwidth, storage, and to validate transactions on the system and secure the system. So we call that a protocol-based open platform. Anybody can write software and deploy a program onto that system permissionlessly, and with certain rights and privileges, anybody can use that software. On top of that protocol-based open platform, many others can build protocol-based open platforms, and we're doing that sort of thing in journalism and in other niches. So it's about identifying what your goals are.
Yeah.
One of the things that we found early was that we needed an identity construct for this new paradigm in computing, and we also, it was sort of perfect timing, perfect storm. Cambridge Analytica was happening, Facebook was being assailed in so many different directions, and GDPR was happening in Europe with respect to essentially improper or not the greatest amount of care with respect to personally identifying information that corporations were holding without sufficient care for individuals. And so that perfect storm drew attention to the fact that in the Web 2.0 world, there's a lot of pollution. There's a lot of exploitation of weak infrastructure, enabling all of us to be turned into products, basically, on the internet, on the World Wide Web, and that was technology that was serving us well for quite a while, started to have very negative externalities, and has started to create a very difficult situation for individuals with respect to identity theft and just abuse of personal information. And it has driven the conversation towards Web3, towards decentralized World Wide Web, towards decentralized identity. And there's now a large foundation that's advocating building a self-sovereign identity that we can all control, and essentially have better hygiene built into the system around how our identity is controlled and used, and how our personal information is controlled, so encrypted and selectively disclosable by us in situations that we designate. So there may be some role. A little funny to me that I'm advocating external governmental regulation, but there may be some sort of role. Either industry gets together and creates incentives and penalties for essentially unhealthy behavior, or some sort of external imposition of incentive could be applied.
Well, it's fascinating what you're saying, and I have a few questions, but before that, let me please welcome Satya Tripathi. We introduced you before you came, so we will have a question for you in a minute, but everybody knows your role and your position, so we're very appreciative of your time. So Joe, back to you. What you're describing is fascinating because it's not unlike the state of innovation in the world we occupy right now. We have a number of innovators looking to create new materials, biobenign materials, materials that are from renewable feedstocks. And there is no agreement on what that material is that is called bioplastic, or what is oxidegradable plastic. Everybody can call it whatever they want. And so there is huge disagreement in the industry about the nature of this material, what it's comprised of, how you get to it, what are the characteristics. The industry feedback, which you talked about, is really important, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation did a lot in that respect to get industry in a pre-competitive space to talk about what their biggest needs are. The only challenge there is that they're only focusing on packaging, and plastics and plastic pollution has multiple impacts in agriculture, climate change, and so there is much more to it, but the model is there, implementing a circular economy model. But the one that fascinates me the most, and I didn't think I'd live to hear a tech entrepreneur to talk about this, is the mention of policy. Because we talk a lot about policy, and in the space of plastics, what is really important is that investments of companies like yours, Michael, and others are substantial in the current existing infrastructure. And so there's got to be a way to offset or to incentivize the use of new materials or new packaging or new models. It's expensive. Innovation is expensive. So we always look into what is the role of policy to support that effort. And in your case, can you talk a little bit more about this before I ask Satya to talk about policy? So good, bad, how, non-existent?
I can talk very, very briefly about policy. I think I may have said all that I have to say about it, but essentially it does come down to mechanism design. I prefer incentivization. I prefer organizations, whether they're in the industry or whether they want to influence the industry, coming together and providing financial incentives to many different entities to do the research. And yes, there are going to be disagreements. There have to be disagreements, because if somebody knew what the answer was right now, then we would go straight to it. And so we need to use free market dynamics to incentivize many different actors to do the research, to do the experiments, to create candidate feedback loops. And it's going to take quite a while, as it does in our ecosystem, to figure out what works. Our ecosystem is very immature, and it's a vast solution space, and so we are always very happy when some new little project pops up to try to explore this approach to consensus algorithms or decentralized storage or something like that. And I think you really have to draw a lot of interested, well-resourced parties to that space to incentivize them. We have a bounty system, for instance. We're trying to do things in a very decentralized way. We've actually used it in a Manila project to clean up plastic as a sort of a demonstration project. But those are the kinds of mechanisms, sort of grassroots incentivization. And we found, with respect to consensus mechanisms, that it isn't... it probably shouldn't be all about reward, as it is for people who understand blockchain. In order to keep all these different computers in sync, you need something called a consensus mechanism. And consensus is really where we get our trust infrastructure from. It is inefficient and insufficient to only reward people via a mechanism where they're trying to solve puzzles to achieve consensus across all these nodes. A much more efficient system actually has a carrot and a stick. And so sort of shaping behavior with punishment, I think the literature is starting to indicate that that is necessary.
Interesting. And then, Satya, I'll let you catch your breath, because I wanted to ask Saskia a question about this while we're talking about innovation. So you work with innovators around the world, and entrepreneurs as well. And so in that vein, talking about what supports innovation and entrepreneurship, how do you choose, how do you know which innovation is worth supporting? How do you pick the ones that you invest in, because you have an investment fund as well? And how do you measure success? What is success for that kind of innovation? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So first of all, Daniela, thanks so much for having me. I will start with saying I'm no plastics expert.
That's fine.
I started Yunus Social Business 8 years ago with the intention to do something about poverty, to see how we can use the force of business to solve the problems of poverty. And in general, we do it, I'm just using that as context so you understand later on what I say. On the one hand, we help local entrepreneurs that are social entrepreneurs to build their businesses through financing them and supporting them. And on the other hand, we also work with large corporations to see how can we use their core competences to build these types of companies that solve problems in the world. So that kind of as a little bit of context. And our goal as ending poverty as the basis of everything, that's why actually plastics or waste in general is a major problem for us, because in the countries that we work in, developing countries and emerging countries, waste is a major issue. There are no functioning waste management systems. There's usually also not too much regulation, even though that is actually coming up as we speak. And so basically people in poverty drown in waste, but they also use it as an opportunity to build their own income. So it also has a positive side to it. And I did want to share one thing about regulation, because you mentioned that one example, and I'm sure many of you in the room know that, regulation that has worked is, for example, in East Africa, in Rwanda, where the government has actually forbidden plastics to be used, or certain plastics to be used. So even if you go and come into the country from Uganda or any other airport, you're actually checked on plastics, and they've significantly been able to reduce that and actually also spur innovation, because simple things like using a net to go shopping instead of a plastic bag can already help and reduce massive amounts of plastic. So that kind of as backdrop. And I would say actually the entrepreneurs that we work with, they're not necessarily always the crazy entrepreneurs that come up with amazing innovations around materials, et cetera, because you need significant amounts of finance to be able to develop those kinds of new compounds or new bioplastics or whatever it may be. Often the entrepreneurs that we work with usually have focus more on innovation that is around the system that waste is being used in. So to give you a couple of examples, we have a company in our portfolio in India that ensures that less waste actually makes it to the landfill, because they have an app, and individual consumers and also companies can just say, please pick up the waste at my house today. And then people, and then the waste, basically the recycling company goes there, picks it up, and the company that we work with recycles it and at least uses it again. Sometimes he uses it several times. It's not perfect, I know that, but it is at least one way to reduce less waste to landfill. Another company in Brazil works with condo owners and people living in condos to put up recycling containers, because it again doesn't exist, and people are educated in those buildings of how to use waste and what impact waste actually can have, and how you can separate it and then really create a better use out of it. Or we have another social business in Colombia where actually it's interesting, it's completely just in that one community that said we don't want to drown in waste, and they developed sort of a virtual currency. Since I'm sitting next to you, I need to mention that, where they just say, okay, if you bring the waste, then you can have food for that, and we can then sell it. So there are various mechanisms. Or another large corporations we're working with is actually saying, they're in cling film. It's a German Mittelstand company that does cling film and plastic bags and those kinds of things. And they say, we know that we're not doing a good service to the environment, but we don't really have a solution of how to change it. So what are we going to do? We can't stop our business entirely from one day to another. So what do we do? And they came to us and they said, hey, what could we do? And then we were trying to push them to see, can you not talk to this bioplastics company or these innovators, et cetera, et cetera. But so far there is no viable solution to replace cling film, for example, because bioplastics or those industries, there are no alternatives. They're about 50 years behind the normal chemical industry. And that's why they can't find a solution. So they said, okay, how can we at least make one step more positive? And so in this case, we are working with about 2,000 waste collectors in Bangalore that are collecting waste from landfills. So the waste is already in the landfills. They're collecting it. We've created a little facility in India where the waste is being cleaned, being pelleted. And they can now use and will now use their pellets in their production of garbage bags. So at least you don't produce garbage bags out of new oil, virgin oil, which is such a waste, but at least they're making that out of waste that already was on landfills and was already polluting the environment and possibly
Yeah.
eventually going into the oceans.
Yeah.
So that's one social business that we've been working with, and this single company is ensuring that 2.5% of India's plastic waste is being used.
Yeah.
So it's not much, and we're talking about
Yeah.
small projects, but 2.5% of the entire, something like 115,000 tons of plastic waste that India produces each year is still a significant amount of plastic that is now actually being put to better use. And we're already seeing another big company that is trying to replicate that same logic, that same model in Kenya. So.
And then you put your finger on something else that agrees with what Joe was describing, which is you define the problem. I think half of the challenge is defining the problem. What is the problem you're trying to solve? In your case, it's a very practical problem of communities drowning in waste and creating jobs around it. And that is one way of going at it. We need to put a similar amount of effort into preventing all this from happening in the first place, because we do know that recycling accounts for 10% of the plastic that's made. And no matter how much investment you make in recycling, you still have a big challenge, which is how do you prevent this from happening in the first place? So asking the right question is essential. And the question that we ask is it cleaning the ocean that we're going to go do? Is it preventing from all this from getting into the ocean in the first place? Or is it transforming the industry altogether such that we have biobenign materials and new methods of delivering product to people without waste, which is one way you described, Michael. And Satya, the question to you is, what is the role of policy? You are at the helm of one of the probably the largest international organization working on consumer responsibility, behavior change, and looking to focus on solutions to amongst plastics, amongst other things. What is the role of international policy from your perspective in supporting this effort? Not just bans, but incentivizing the development of solutions. How do you view that?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And sorry for turning up late because I was speaking at another event. And I'm still trying to figure out Davos.
There are no numbers anywhere here.
So I walked through three, four doors before getting into this one.
I know.
So apologies. I think speaking from a policy perspective, I cannot overemphasize the power of policy in changing behavior. So we need to do 4 things to really turn things around. Mm-hmm. Mitigation, adaptation, innovation, and finance. Because everything ends up, where is the money going to come from?
Yeah.
So finance is crucial. So I'll cite a few examples in each of these. Now in terms of mitigation, the best example I can cite is the ozone agreement, or the Montreal Protocol as we know it more popularly as, and the ozone secretariat that was set up. We defined a problem, which is what we've been talking about, and we found the solutions as to what constitutes a solution.
Yeah.
Without that, we'll be wandering around in a fragmented universe. Everybody will be doing a lot within their own realm, within their domain, but it would never add up to what we need to solve the problem. Yeah. That's the first thing. And I cite that because it has been one of the most successful agreements ever in the history of problem solving that humankind has been challenged with.
Yeah.
And that is because we didn't have a political conversation around a treaty. We identified the problem, we found a solution, and we found the resources. We set up an ozone secretariat to go help countries to replicate the business model, and that's why it has worked. And that's why UNFCCC, despite its best effort and close to 30 years of conversations, we are still talking. We talk about the Paris Agreement on mitigation. Paris Agreement is your fast track to 3.2 degrees Celsius. That's Paris Agreement. Everything is voluntary. Nothing is compulsory for anybody. And that we take 3 years for the voluntary to be agreed to be measured. And that's still 3.2 degrees.
Yeah.
And as the emissions gap report tells us, we need to do 3 times more to stay at 2 degrees and 5 times more. That's exponential. Saying it's 5 times more is not, some small thing.
Yeah.
If we really started in the right earnest in 2003, the mitigation pathway was 4% below business as usual. Today it is 18%. In 2028, we'll reach the point of no return. We will never get to 1.5 degrees if we breach that pathway. And that's where we are. That's the
Yeah.
mitigation challenge. And in the policy context, want to cite this example of Turkey,
Yeah.
banning single-use plastic or putting a price on picking up a plastic bag. First day, 70% drop in people accepting a
Yeah.
plastic bag because it costs money. So that's the power of policy. I cannot overemphasize it. Governments really, Prime Minister Modi announced at the World Environment Day last year that he's banning single-use plastic in India by 2022. Now states, and each of these states, some of these states are 200 million people, they're competing with each other to announce a ban and put in place policy. Now that's become a public conversation, which state is doing this and which hasn't. And so the activists are taking on. So I think, we really need to, and so at UN Environment, we're working with a bunch of governments across the world to try and get a plastics resolution in the next UN Environment Assembly. For governments to voluntarily commit to banning single-use plastic by a certain year. It's a conversation that's still ongoing, but we certainly hope that it comes to the Assembly and gets approved, because that's
Yeah.
where all the ministers are gathering. That's the mitigation part. The adaptation is even a bigger challenge, because you have an established infrastructure that produces plastic. Lives depend on it. There are industries,
Yeah.
there are billions of dollars invested, there are millions of people working. So how do you get them to adapt and change course? And then of course innovation, and that's where the other panelists have brought out very salient and wonderful examples of what is possible. So how do you bring all of that together and create an army of innovators who we can then again test against a certain standard that the scientific community agrees on, and then replicate that with the help of everybody that's willing. And then the finance. On the finance, I want to give you an example. Before I came to UN Environment to be their Assistant Secretary General 3 months ago, I was going around something called sustainable finance facilities. When we started, people thought we were crazy. And I was doing this pro bono at that time because I thought this is possible and we must try before we accept failure. Because accepting failure without trying is so lame. So we decided to do this. In Indonesia, we set up something called the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility. It leverages private finance for public good. We never touch money, we're a catalyst. So we basically bring people together. So we call it a distributed risk model, not a shared risk. So you don't sink or swim together. You break down the problem into manageable parts. If people haven't invested, so the first project we have already done there is $350 million. It's a partnership with Michelin, the tire company, setting up the world's largest sustainable rubber plantation in 50% of a concession. The other 50% is coming back as a virgin rainforest. WWF is leading that effort. And all this without the government of Indonesia, without having to put a single penny into it. Entirely private finance. And in India, then we set up the Sustainable India Finance Facility. And I hosted a high-level lunch dialogue today with the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh state. And that state is about 55 million people, 6 million farmers. And so our partnership is we're deploying $2.3 billion to support them. It's a fantastic model for all of us to think how it can change the world. 6 million farmers, all smallholders, cultivating about 8 million hectares of cropland. And they're doing something called zero budget natural farming, which is basically farming without any synthetic chemical fertilizers or pesticides. And it's not organic, because organic in my view is an immoral arrangement of the rich for the rich. So the rich will produce for the rich and the poor will never be able to afford it, because we can never grow in those quantities for it to become mass market. So natural farming is a process of bioinoculation. As of today, they have converted 524,000 farmers. Not 10, not 100, not 1,000, not 10,000. And they are well on their way to 6 million farmers. And it's a great business model because we're deploying $2.3 billion. BNP Paribas is our advisor, and we have started that process and we're deploying that money. But what is happening there is that that particular state at this time spends $1 billion in fertilizer subsidies every year. So with the savings from their fertilizer subsidies, they'll pay back the loan actually.
Yeah.
So it will be cost neutral to the government, and it changes everything at system scale, and in 5 years' time, of which they've already done 18 months, they will save $1 billion every year in perpetuity. That's repurposing public expenditure. So it sets right a lot of things. So we need to think out of the box and find these system scale solutions that are possible. We need to arrest the flow of plastic into the ocean. I mean, everybody talks about ocean plastic and how do we get, but you need to stop the flow. Without that, it's mindless.
Yeah.
We need to stop the flow. We need to deal with that as a different problem. We need to deal with this as a different problem. We need to think of the employees and the industries that are in this business. How do we turn them around? And so we need to focus the whole thing around mitigation, adaptation, innovation, and finance. Thank you.
Thank you. And you should know that the next UN Assembly in Nairobi is focused on innovation. So we hope to have a lot of productive discussions around creating funding models for innovation around alternatives to plastics, not just waste management and recycling, which are important, well understood and valuable, but the rest of it, which is how do we prevent this material from being used the way it is right now, so broadly, and for purposes that it was never intended to, like single use and disposables. We have about 10 minutes, and I made myself a promise that I will open to you for questions, because I could sense that there's a lot of interest in what every one of the panelists said. So, questions? Yes.
To Michael, I know you're in a difficult position. You have a long business with many years of operation. Just want to say that when I hear you speak about the timescales that it will take, there's a lot of frustration and anger that comes up in me, and it's not it's not against you. It's just about the situation and knowing that plastic will still be going into the sea. And so the things that come into my mind, let's make solutions. What can we do to turn this into? What can you do? How can you do it faster? And then, okay, I'm sure you're working to your margins and you have other issues. So then it turns into there are other people around that are angry and frustrated as well, and they don't see alternatives. So if you were to direct comment to them, to individual consumers, what do you need? So this is just, I don't know, another thought. What do you need individual consumers to do to help you and help all of us stop plastic going into the ocean, assist us to get rid of single-use plastic entirely? Is there a focus on that? Because when consumers are not just dumb people that are just doing nothing. Given energy, they given a focus, given a direction, they will be active. But does it make sense what I'm saying?
A little bit. So what I would say is that I am impatient, as you are. I'm not happy, and our company is not happy with the situation that exists today. We are, the CEO is speaking on it this week as well. We are regularly being tracked against what we are doing and how we're performing. And it's really an initiative across the whole company and the whole system. So there's what I would say is there's also lots of different solutions that are going to need to be adapted. And you're right, consumers want to help and want to be a part of it. But there is a role for that education too. We're putting it in our advertising in some places, and we're testing and learning to see. We did last year in the UK, this year in the Netherlands, and increasingly as the whole industry, we had a whole campaign in France this summer around it, not just Coke, but the whole industry trying to make sure people understand that a bottle can become another bottle, but to do that, they have to put it in the right place. Because the data actually shows that, interestingly, it's the countryside that derives recycling rates in France. The big city where you would expect the consumers that you're talking about to live actually has 5 times less the collection rates. Paris and Marseille, only 1 in 10 bottles in Paris, and that's not all blaming on the tourists. So we're talking about actually the Parisians that live there too. So there is a need for education to be a part of that as well. And people need to understand what products they can recycle and give them new solutions. And as I mentioned, we're trialing this new thing with groups of companies as well, where you only have refillables, but it requires a lot of investment and people to come together around, partnership platforms. And we've had that. There's, the work here, the Global Plastic Action Partnership is launching new initiatives this week, and they will be talking about their initial pilot countries where private sector and governments like the UK and Canada are coming together to build on a history of what we've been able to do in the water stewardship space. So I guess I would just say that companies are also impatient, and we appreciate the push that is coming as well from consumers, because we know that we have to change in order to be able to adapt. We're really trying to do that. We're doing it in some unique ways. Just a couple of months ago, Coca Cola opened up its intellectual property for what we call plant bottle, so bio-based PET, so derived not from petroleum. Our use of that has taken the equivalent of literally millions of trucks off the road, but we also came to this recognition that we can't be keeping that sort of innovation to ourselves. We need to allow the rest of the world to use that, and so we've opened up that IP, and I think that, people and companies are changing to how they think about that too, and they absolutely want to be part of those solutions and appreciate the engagement that consumers give you on it.
And can I jump in with a thought
Yes.
and suggestion? I agree with you, Daniel, that it is concerning hearing the year 2030 and then what happens if that slips, et cetera. So a blockchain ecosystem is still very immature, but it's putting mechanisms together to enable us to achieve collective action, essentially. So it's
Yeah.
putting identity mechanisms together, reputation mechanisms together, incentivization mechanisms together, punishment mechanisms together. We have a project, our Gnosis team's prediction markets. It's a decentralized exchange of tokens. They are setting up governance of that system via a decentralized organization. Nobody will be in control of it. They're putting together a sort of bare bones functional exchange infrastructure with the vanilla rules and governance. And this governance system will evolve how that exchange operates. So education is great, and this should be part of it. And I think, as I indicated before, some sort of external forcing functions, be it government regulation or some sort of punishment mechanisms, really gets people to explore new things much more frantically, much more energetically, much more creatively. And so if many stakeholders in the ecosystem get together to use decentralized governance mechanisms to put together a sort of Apollo program for stopping plastic pollution and maybe cleaning up plastic pollution, we might have a better shot at it. We can involve government when it wants to be involved, but we shouldn't rely on government because it can do a 180 very quickly in different situations. And we can, I think, impose regulation or impose punishment. So if we have these mechanisms called proof of stake mechanisms, if many companies that are putting plastics into the ecosystem pledge, and I wouldn't suggest that one company do that, I would suggest that a whole bunch of them get together and they pledge that they're going to put each $10 million or more of assets into a structure, into a smart contract agreement. And if they don't achieve certain goals, they will be essentially self-punished. So these are self-incentivization mechanisms that essentially serve as punishment in order to potentially shape behavior. Those mechanisms are not incredibly mature right now, but they're there to be made use of.
You know
So-
what would be fantastic is if you help us put together a mechanism in place that unites the innovators in that space, because it's a very disparate effort right now. We have people all over the world working on this. We have some of them here who are the Planet Care people. Wave your hand. There they are. So we have innovators around the world. We look at about 200 innovations on an annual basis, and all of these are people who care about this and have a piece of the solution and could co-create and engage in ideation with each other. It would be
It
great.
would be a very popular project at our company.
Well, you have audience that witnessed that you made a commitment to us to make that happen. Thank you.
Could I just add that in
Please.
terms of policy, we have huge swaths of the world that do not allow recycled content in food and beverage packaging. You can't have a circular economy if it's forbidden to actually reuse the material. So there is absolutely a role for policy there. And to your point, while it's not for punishment, the Circulate Capital, there are 6 companies that put $15 million each into a fund to actually be part of driving some innovative solutions in the part of the world where the problem is the worst. So, and yes, we hope to get those investments back, and that's the model of what's been set up with the new fund, but people are taking the risk to actually try to do that and drive some of that innovation.
Other questions? Yes?
I'm Renat from South Pole. We work with a lot of corporates very interested in the plastics topic, but we're coming more from the climate space.
Yeah?
And my fear is that we are embarking on the same 3 mistakes that the climate debate is stuck. One is that we have this fight between emerging markets and developed markets. Who is like finger pointing? Whose fault was it? The second is that we finger point at each other like this solution is not that good, recycling is not that great. So instead of embarking all solutions, we are finger pointing. And the third is that ownership is not clear. It's a common space, the oceans, and that's why everybody says, look, I'm totally in favor of doing something, but as long as not everybody is doing something, unfortunately can't do anything. I think these are the 3 big problems of the climate debate. My question to the panel is, how can we avoid in the early stage of this debate that plastic is not going down the same path, and we are here really more solution oriented, and I would like to get some views on that.
So I would just ask Satya for you to comment, because I know you work on this, but I wanted to address one of the statements you made. I don't agree that there is finger pointing and dissatisfaction with the solutions that are out there. All we're saying is there is a big portfolio of solutions, and we cannot choose one over another. We need to put an equitable amount of effort into all of them. Behavior change, prevention, new materials, as well as waste management and collection. All of these are important. So we need to use the whole portfolio. Satya, do you want to comment on the other?
I think I agree with him that the climate change debate has been one of whose historical responsibility it is and who should pay whom.
Yeah.
And that actually has, as justified as it is in terms of, if you're speaking from the perspective of a certain number of countries who are basically saying my carbon footprint is 80 tons per capita, and there's somebody else whose it is 800.
Right.
So where's the equity in this? So I think as justified as they are in that debate, but it is not going to save the planet. That's the bottom line. What will save the planet is identifying solutions that work, focusing on that, finding champions in every street, every community, every country, and empowering the champions. Mm-hmm. That's what is going to help save the planet. Otherwise, we are a biomass of zombies, and forgive me for saying this, very so-called intelligent people, we've been to the best schools, it beats me. Because, you see, managing life is all about managing risk. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a bank, whether it's a person, how we allow our children to go out to the street or not, or take risks, everything is about managing risks. And this is an existential risk that we refuse to acknowledge, the severity of the risk. In 10 years' time, we will never come back to this conversation. We'll be having a much more serious conversation if we don't fix the problem now. So this is about raising ambition to a scale that we have never thought of ever before.
Yeah.
And when I see the passion of people like him, his anger, I understand his anger as a citizen of the world. And I was speaking at the New York Youth Climate Summit 3 days ago, and I basically told the young people that had assembled and they clapped when I came, I said, guys, you should be very angry when you see people like me. Because my generation has stolen everything from your generation. We have been irresponsible, we have been flippant, we have been profligate, we have wasted the natural resources that we should have protected and preserved for you. That's what it is. So we need to wake up and collaborate, find solutions, and really make it work. Otherwise, whether we point fingers or not, whether we are nice to each other or not, that's not going to solve the problem. We need to focus on solutions on a mega scale.
Yeah.
And we have very little time.
Raise the ambition to an unprecedented level to be commensurate with the size of the problem we're facing.
Absolutely.
So on this note, I have to thank the panelists. We're past our time, but I'm hoping you will stay around. Consensus is hosting a drinks reception afterwards, so stick around and hopefully you get the opportunity to talk to everyone. Thank you so much for your contribution.